At Rabaul, the Japanese had to decide what action they would take in the face of this new development. Admiral Kusaka wanted the army to provide at least a battalion to make a counter-landing. As usual, he spoke of a force far too small to do the job. General Imamura said no. Commitment of a single battalion against General McClure's force would be like pouring water on a hot stone, he said. It evaporates. As for making a major landing, using a regiment perhaps, he already had the answer from Tokyo 2 days earlier. Imperial General Headquarters had instructed him to start the gradual withdrawal of troops from the Central Solomons. They were to fall back slowly, taking as much toll on the Allies as possible, and finally to defend only Rabaul to the last. So there was never any question of launching a major offensive to stop the Americans at Vella Lavella. The Japanese actually did not expect to hold Kolombangara or the Shortlands or even Bougainville. Even Rabaul was already written off in the strategic books of the Imperial General Staff. The line at which the Americans would be stopped had been established, and the closest point was Truk. The important tactical matter at this stage of Japanese thinking was the salvation of the troops and equipment on Kolombangara. To guarantee this, they needed a base nearby, and the northern tip of Vella Lavella Island, at the opposite end from the American invasion, was the logical point. Admiral Kusaka and General Imamura agreed that a base should be established there immediately. 2 days after the American invasion, 2 companies of troops and a navy unit were moved south in a number of barges. Rear Admiral Matsuji Juin took 4 destroyers to accompany them and protect them from American attack. This troop move marked a new Japanese naval policy in the South Pacific, which came as a direct result of the sinking of 3 Japanese destroyers in the battle at Vella Gulf a few days earlier. Indirectly, the change reflected the loss of some 40 destroyers in the past year or so in Solomon's waters. Admiral Ijuin had recommended that, in future, destroyers be used only for escort and that they not seek battle in addition. Also, the modern destroyers should not again be used for troop transport. The command at Rabaul and Truk had listened to him, and just before sailing, Admiral Ijuin had conferred with his destroyer captains. He told them of the changed policy. Instead of seeking action under any conditions, the destroyer captains were to remember that their mission was to get the troops ashore, and that was the end of their mission. It was a distinct departure from the past. The 4 ships left Rabaul during the hours of darkness on August 17, bound for a rendezvous point where they would meet 20 barges carrying 400 troops for Horenyu on Vella Lavella. They had not gone 100 miles from Rabaul, however, when the radio operator of the flagship intercepted an American scout plane report, and they knew the enemy would be out looking for them. Juin radioed Rabaul for more air support. Sure enough, that scout plane sent the message to Admiral Wilkinson that 4 Japanese destroyers were coming south, and Wilkinson ordered Captain Thomas J. Ryan to take 4 American destroyers up the slot to meet them. When they got to Gizo Strait, they were spotted by a Japanese float plane, which in turn warned Admiral Ijuin that the Americans were coming their way. Meanwhile, Admiral Mitcher at Guadalcanal had sent out 8 torpedo bomber fighter Avenger bombers that attacked the Japanese ships as they neared Vella Lavella. The planes bombed, the ships fired at them, no one scored. 2 more American planes attacked and missed. Meanwhile, a Japanese float plane spotted the American destroyers and gave position, course and speed to Admiral Ijuin, while the Americans found the Japanese ships on their radar screens. So far it was a toss-up. The float plane bombed the American ships ineffectually, and soon the air was disturbed by flying shells as the 2 flotillas exchanged fire. The Japanese also fired torpedoes at long range. What came next was an exercise in manoeuvring on both sides, which ended with the Japanese destroyer Hamikaze hit and the destroyer Isakaze damaged by near misses. The Shigure fired torpedoes at short range at one American destroyer, but missed. Then, to the disgust of Captain Ryan, Admiral Ijuin disengaged and went speeding off at 35 knots to Rabaul. The Americans found it hard to understand why the Japanese had declined the battle, but Ijuin had done his job. In the confusion, nearly all the barges got into the Vella Lavella shore where they holed up in coves and waited for the enemy to go away. The next day they moved to Horenyu and delivered their passengers, Within a week, the Japanese had a new barge base there. The American destroyers did knock out a few of the small craft escorts of the barges, but by any standard, the reinforcement mission had to be regarded as a success. And these days, the Japanese were willing to settle for a limited success in such endeavours. Captain Hara of the Shigure went back to Rabaul believing he had sunk an American cruiser, but he had not. That night, however, the Japanese did do some serious damage. Faced with the problem of American air superiority over the Central Solomons, the Japanese had begun to evolve some new techniques of attack. Most effective of these was the night attack by small units of bombers flying low to avoid the radar. On the night of August 17, the second group of Americans coming in to Vella Lavella were hit by the Japanese Air Force. A group of 3 bombers came in low and dropped their bombs on the cluster of tank landing ship off the beach. The ships headed out to sea for the night, but Japanese planes trailed them and attacked again. This time they scored a number of near misses, one of which later caused a fire and explosions that blew tank landing ship 396 apart, and tank landing ship 339 was bounced up on the beach by a near miss. The destroyers Waller and Phillip manoeuvred at high speed to lay a smokescreen and collided. The Waller had to go back to Tulagi for repair, and the lumbering 10-12 knots tank landing ship were the easiest targets the Japanese had yet had, and the bombers made the best of it. In the next few days they scored a number of hits on the tank landing ship, and even more near misses. But the tank landing ship were tougher than they looked, and all of them survived after that first mishap. The Japanese air attacks were troublesome, but the acid test came in the Japanese High Command assessment at the end of those first few days. The enemy landing was not dislodged. With the American invasion of Vella Lavella, the admirals and generals at Rabaul decided to shorten their lines of communication. They began the process of withdrawing troops and equipment from the major front-line bases, Kolombangara, the Shortlands, Santa Isabel Island, and several other spots where they had maintained air and naval bases and stations for communications and island traffic. Now, in August 1943, began a renewed period of attrition that was grinding on the men of both sides. The situation of the summer of 1942 was almost precisely reversed. The Americans had the preponderance of power in the air and on the sea, but not enough to destroy the enemy. The result was a constant series of air raids and sea raids, involving relatively small forces and accomplishing very little. The Japanese, in one sense, accomplished more than the Americans. They began to get their troops out of these zones that were to be abandoned, staging them northward in small craft that moved like Chinese river pirate junks, holing up in jungle country by day and venturing out across small bodies of water by night, whipsawing back and forth on the way north to safety. As for the larger craft, both sides used them with caution. Admiral Ijuin had a healthy respect for the American radar. It had changed completely the odds in destroyer night fighting, and the improved training of the American destroyer men had brought a new element into such combat. For the Japanese, the trouble was that the American radar made it hard to close with the enemy. For officers who had served in the halcyon days when every encounter was a victory, it seemed hard to adjust to these new times when the High Command urged them to be cautious and stick to the narrow limits of their missions, rather than seeking battle. But after all, as Admiral Ijuin put it did not pay to sink an enemy ship if it cost too dearly in men and Japanese ships. The Japanese evacuation of Santa Isabel began on August 17 and proceeded almost without incident. The evacuation of Rakata Bay came next. There the Japanese had maintained their effective seaplane base, manned by about 3,400 men. That evacuation began a day or two after the move at Santa Isabel. It was hampered by Admiral Wilkinson's cruisers and destroyers, which roamed the seas of the Central Solomons. One night in mid-August, a heavily laden Japanese destroyer force set sail from Rabaul, prepared to deliver supplies to Rakata and take off 1,000 men. The ship's commander then learned that American cruisers were lurking off that seaplane base, and they turned back, but the major difficulty for the Japanese came from the air. Almost every destroyer heading south on a rescue or supply mission was bombed at some point in its journey. Rabaul grew short of destroyers again, because so many were in the shipyards or sent up to Truk for repairs of bomb damage. Several of the ships that had been serving for many months in the South Pacific were examined, found to be in terrible condition, and sent back to Japan for major overhaul. That again created complications. The Americans took their share of bombing punishment too. At Vella Lavella, the beachhead was bombed every day. In the first 2 weeks of September, the Japanese made 42 separate raids on the beachhead, most of them after dark. The operation of clearing the Japanese from the island was not moving as rapidly as Halsey had expected. Finally, Admiral Halsey decided to clear out all the Japanese on Vella Lavella and brought in fresh troops to do the job. These were men of the 3rd New Zealand Division under Major General H.J.E. Barrowclough. Their task, which looked easy on paper, was to drive the Japanese into a pocket on the northwest tip of the island and seal them off. Barrowclough's troops began their push, but the Japanese did what they had done on New Georgia. They dug in and resisted in a manner that must have gladdened the hearts of the Imperial General Staff. Some days the New Zealanders made 600 yards. Those were good days, and some days they made 200 yards, and every yard meant blood and battering. Meanwhile, the Seabees came into Barracoma to build an airbase, which was one of the main reasons for moving against Vella Lavella in the first place. When it could be put into operation, fighters could go all the way to Rabaul with auxiliary tanks, something the Americans had not been able to do before. To make even better use of Vella Lavella, Admiral Halsey decided to put a marine staging base there for future attacks up the Solomons chain. On the morning of September 17, the 1st Marine Amphibious Corps sent a detachment under command of Major Donald M. Schmuck to land at Ruravai, up the coast of Vella Lavella, and set up this base. There was some difficulty in landing because of the beach terrain, but the troops got ashore successfully, and so did the guns and trucks and other equipment. Suddenly out of the sun came 15 Japanese dive bombers and 20 Zeros. The Marines manned their guns. They shot down one dive bomber which burst into flames and crashed into the sea. But the other Japanese bombers came boring in and dropped 500-pound bombs on the beach. The Marines shot down 2 more bombers, which crashed in the jungle, and another went off trailing smoke, but the raid had to be called a success for the Japanese. One 40mm gun was destroyed. Every man of the crew of another gun was killed by one bomb. As the bombers flew off, the Zeros came flashing across the beach, strafing. They did a lot of damage before the United States Combat Air Patrol appeared to chase after them as they flew northward. Schmuck's force was hit fairly hard, 32 dead and 58 wounded, and it would have been worse had he not insisted that every man dig a foxhole as soon as he got ashore, before beginning work on unloading and moving equipment around. Such Japanese attacks came so frequently and did such damage that in a few days Major Schmuck arranged to have all supplies unloaded at Barracoma, where the Marines had brought in 90mm and 155mm guns. The Japanese had quickly learned respect for the heavy anti-aircraft fire there and let the beachhead alone. So by mid-September the Allies were ashore in force on Vella Lavella, and the issue was not really in doubt, but the Japanese were not yet finished, and although they could not win, they could exact a heavy price in lives and equipment. This was the agony of the War of Attrition. By September 1943, the ragged edges of the New Georgia campaign were smoothed out, and the Allies held the whole island. However, there was still hard fighting on Arundel Island, across Hathorn Sound. As long as the Japanese held any of this territory, they could bring in field artillery and cause all sorts of damage, from shelling Munda Airfield to sinking ships. General Sasaki knew this very well, and he had already shown it. His artillery on Kolombangara was harrying Munda Point. The American campaign on Arundel went like no other. The 172nd Infantry landed and found absolutely no organized Japanese resistance. There were only about 250 Japanese on the island, a single company of the 229th Regiment. The 172nd, after a bad time at Zanana, was reinforced and somewhat rested, and the troops moved in with the contained vigour of veteran jungle fighters. But here, unlike New Georgia, the Japanese dissolved before them. That reads like easy work, but it was quite the opposite. the Japanese emerged after dark to cut lines of communication and throats. When General Sasaki learned that the Americans had landed on Arundel in force, he countered with force. He began sending in the Japanese 13th Infantry from Kolombangara to Arundel, with instructions to harass the Allied troops as long as possible. After the Vella Lavella landings, when it became apparent to Sasaki that the Americans were bypassing Kolombangara, he sent in more troops of the 13th Infantry, with instructions that they were to hold out until the Kolombangara forces could be evacuated back to Rabaul. The new commander on Arundel was Major Kikuta, who had performed nobly with the 1st Battalion of the 13th Infantry on New Georgia. He began by organising an ambush, and thereafter on Arundel dealing with ambushes became a way of life for the invaders. Admiral Halsey's plans for the future movement up the Solomon's chain depended on reduction of any and all points that could cause trouble for the future. At Arundel, nothing seemed to go as planned, and after 2 weeks on the island, the troops of the 172nd were bogged down and generally on the defensive. But the Japanese were not in such good shape either, although the Americans did not know it. By September 5, Kikuta's force was short of supply. They had run out of salt, flour, soy sauce, and powdered bean paste, all the things that made a Japanese soldier's diet palatable, and were subsisting on rice. They were ragged, and many of them went barefooted. Back on August 20, the Japanese Navy had announced by radio that it would resupply Arundel by September 7, but by September 5 there had been no further word, although there should have been. The reason the supplies had not come was traceable to the change in policy by the Naval Command, after the serious losses of destroyers in recent weeks. Destroyers were to be withdrawn as much as possible from the supply system, and small boats were to be used to do the job. In fact, 70 boats were sent out, carrying fish, ammunition, and other supplies. But some were sunk, some capsized, some ran aground before they reached the area, and some, captained by seamen unfamiliar with the waters, simply got lost and never arrived. The Japanese on Kolombangara suffered. The figures showed that 220 tons of supplies were shipped out for that island, but that only 14 tons arrived during this period. As for the detachment on Arundel Island, they got nothing at all and soon were nearing starvation. There was only one solution: steal the food from the enemy, and in a series of night raids they did just that, stealing enough to keep themselves going. During this period, the nightly whooping and shouting and shining of lights was not primarily to kill the Americans, but to distract them so that other Japanese could get into their supply dumps. Arundel Island was in a uniquely difficult position to receive supplies from any point but Kolombangara. Surrounded by American-held territory, except on the north, its waters teemed with enemy craft, and most of the supply boats sent toward Arundel were lost. But by constant effort, General Sasaki managed to get enough food and ammunition across to continue the battle. Also, all this while, troops of the 13th Regiment were filtering into the island, and by September 10 the Japanese were stepping up the action against the Americans. This was a classic delaying tactic, and it was working. On September 10, the commander of the 13th Regiment, Colonel Tomonari, visited Arundel and inspired the troops there to further glory. On the morning of September 15, the Japanese staged a counterattack so strenuous that it completely stalled the American advance along the island. The 172nd Infantry had to ask for reinforcement. When General Griswold heard of the difficulty, he assigned the 27th Infantry and a number of marine tanks to Arundel to clear off that island, so the advance up the Solomon's chain could begin again. On the night of September 16, the tanks came ashore in a blinding rainstorm and went into position. The next morning they attacked during a rainstorm, supported by the new 27th Infantry troops. They surprised the Japanese completely and managed to gain 500 yards that day. At the rate of 500 yards a day, the Allies would have been able to clear the northwest section of the island in about 10 days. Colonel Douglas Sugg of the 27th Infantry was so pleased with the advance of the 17th that on September 18 he tried the same performance again. But this time he found that the Japanese had brought in two 37mm anti-tank guns and placed them in a position that commanded the only tank approaches. The Japanese opened fire beyond the range the tanks' guns could reach, and before the attack had gotten well underway, 2 of the tanks had been knocked out. The Marines escaped from the vehicles only because the United States infantrymen were able to lay down a devastating field of fire on the whole Japanese area. The next day the advance began again, and this time the infantry was all around the tanks and shot at anything that moved. The Japanese, who constantly tried to come up close with magnetic mines to stop the tanks, were unable to get close enough. That day the attack made great progress toward the northern tip of Arundel. When General Sasaki learned of the American reinforcements and the progress of the attack, he decided the 13th Regiment had done all it could, and he withdrew the remaining troops on the night of September 20. His casualties had been high, about 350 dead and about 500 wounded. But they had done precisely what he had asked. They had held up the American advance for more than 3 weeks, giving General Imamura and Admiral Kusaka time to build up the defences of Rabaul. He had preserved the bulk of his force in 2 campaigns, New Georgia and Arundel, and they were ready to be moved north to fight again. American casualties had not been too high, 44 dead and 256 wounded, because of the enormous firepower of the infantry units. The real casualty had been time, and by the 3rd week of September the mass evacuation of Japanese from the old forward bases was well underway. They were removed from Buka and all the other bases south of Bougainville. The Japanese were certain this island would be the next point of invasion. They were prepared once again for the same sort of battle of attrition, designed to slow the Americans down, while Imperial General Headquarters, hopefully but not very realistically, worked out a new offensive program. Hopeful Tokyo certainly was, the government guided largely by army officers who had virtually no experience with Western powers. Unrealistic it was also, as Admiral Yamamoto and a number of other military figures had pointed out before the war. Japan had extended its resources to the utmost to conquer what it had. There was not enough steel, not enough aluminum, not enough oil to build a new armada and equip whole new armies to fight in the South Pacific. The Japanese were now moving more rapidly, pushed by the Americans. They harried New Zealand troops advancing through the jungle of Vella Lavella, in the same way they had harassed the Americans on Arundel, and for the same reason, buying time for General Sasaki. The Allies captured the Japanese barge staging base at Horanyu on September 14. Thereafter, Vella Lavella had no further value to the Japanese. All that was left was to evacuate the 600 or 700 Japanese troops left in the northwest corner of the island. On the day that Arundel Island was evacuated by the Japanese, General Sasaki also moved the troops off Gizo Island to Kolombangara. There were then about 10,000 Japanese Army and Navy personnel on the latter island, and it was the responsibility of General Sasaki and the Navy to get them off safely. Here is the course of events from the official Japanese history of the war. September 23, the planning for the Kolombangara Island garrison's withdrawal began, and from dawn on, B-24 bombers struck the small boat harbour. The American heavy artillery at Munda bombarded the Vila defence perimeter, destroying one 13-centimetre gun and killing 9 men. From Arundel Island all day long could be heard explosions and engine noises. September 24, the battle situation was the same. 8 men were killed by sporadic bombardment from Wanawana and Arundel Islands. The commander of the 2nd Small Boat Flotilla came to make contact with General Sasaki and returned to Choiseul. The time of withdrawal approached, accompanied by heavy American pressure. September 25, a formation of 59 American bombers attacked, and 2 13-centimetre gun installations were completely entombed by the bombing. In the morning, the Promontory gun's powder magazine suffered a direct hit, and a whole series of explosions began. Admiral Ijuin was given the responsibility of taking the Japanese troops off Kolombangara. This was to be done in several runs by 25 Japanese destroyers during the last moonless nights of September. They would come to Tuki Point, on the north shore of Kolombangara, pick up troops, and then escort the many barges northward. Given the services of the Pearl Harbor codebreakers, Admiral Wilkinson had advance information that they would do just this, and on September 22 he sent Admiral Merrill's cruiser force up to the waters off Kolombangara to look for the Japanese. The cruisers and destroyers went up the next night and the next, but radio intelligence intercepts could not give them everything, and at first they concentrated on the wrong area and found no Japanese. Then, on the night of September 25, they were steaming along when a raft of torpedoes began appearing, and one very nearly struck the cruiser Columbia. Admiral Wilkinson remembered what had happened to too many American cruisers under similar conditions, and he withdrew the Merrill force. He substituted a destroyer patrol, but when the destroyers came up at night, they were snooped on by the Japanese float planes. The airmen dropped the special flares that warned the Japanese that American destroyers were about, and dropped them right over the destroyers for the most part. This spotlighting impeded the Americans no end. In fact, the Americans were singularly blind to the Japanese evacuation system, as the events of the next few days showed. September 27 was the beginning of the heavy traffic out of Kolombangara. That morning, the Americans began a whole series of airstrikes against the island, indicating the build-up of the sort of pressure that in the past had signalled an American invasion. The pressure was particularly felt in the stepped-up American air effort against troop concentration points to try to stop the withdrawal. That day, American planes hit Kolombangara all day long. The East Wharf was attacked at 7:54 in the morning by 77 bombers, then by a lone P-38, next by a B-25, again at 9 o'clock by 4 F-4Us, and by another 4 Navy fighters early in the afternoon. The Jakku base was hit just about as frequently. All this American effort really did not put much of a damper on the withdrawal. When evening came, 2 groups of Daihatsus, armed barges, something like American infantry landing crafts, set out from Choiseul bound for Kolombangara. The plan called for them to go into shore, load up with troops, and then meet their covering destroyers just offshore. Obviously, proper timing was an essential to the success of such a program. The No. 2 barge squadron set out from Choiseul Island at 5:30 p.m. for Kolombangara. At about 10 o'clock, the Tanegashima unit encountered 4 PT boats and what they thought were 4 American destroyers. The destroyers were actually 5: Captain M.J. Gillen's Osborne, Claxtory Dyson, Spence and Foote. In the resulting action, 3 Japanese army barges were lost, and 1 Navy barge was sunk. Personnel loss was limited to 51 men, because Ensign Gidan Takanaka had the presence of mind to beach the other boats. He was helped immeasurably by the float planes' bedeviling of the United States destroyers. The timing worked very well. Precisely as written in the orders, the barges arrived in 2 sections. They picked up 800 men and moved outside Gatsu Point, where the destroyers were waiting. The destroyers escorted them to Buna, and they did not see an American craft or plane, and there was no hitch of any kind. The next day, September 28, even bigger plans were afoot. The barges picked up 2,685 troops that night and took them out to the destroyer transports Satsuki, Minazuki, Ayazuki and Amagiri, which were waiting just offshore. The destroyers then sped north toward Rabaul, since they had most of the sick and wounded from the last of the New Georgia campaign on board. Immediately after the destroyers had left, a number of American PT boats showed up and attacked the Daihatsus. Although they were too late to effect the troop withdrawal, they did play hob with the Japanese barges. 2 of these ran aground in their frantic manoeuvring to get away, and within the next 2 days they were bombed and strafed and wrecked by American planes. The next big mission, 6 destroyers again, moved out from Taihei Beach, and the destroyers anchored offshore, and the Daihatsus brought the troops out. This was an aspect of the evacuation that the Americans missed. They believed that the whole evacuation was being carried out by Daihatsus, and that the only function of the destroyers was to guard the flotillas of smaller craft. The fact was that the Japanese followed both schemes. Sometimes there was trouble. On September 29, the Daihatsus came into Jakku Bay to pick up a number of troops. The procedure then was to move on up to the North Cape of Kolombangara, where the destroyers were waiting for the small craft and their human cargoes. But in this case the plan was disrupted by American PT boats, and the Daihatsus had to hole up in bays along the shore. And the next day they made their way cautiously across to Choiseul, and the moment one trip ended, the destroyers turned about and came back. At Tsukino Point, the Navy's Tanegashima Daihatsu Squadron picked up 500 men, and at Shonami Harbour they picked up 400 men. They missed the destroyer contact and had to make their way across a mirror sea, brightly lit by the full moon. The trip from Kolombangara to Choiseul took 6 long, fretful hours. The squadron commander felt very lucky that every boat arrived safely. The next-to-last rescue mission of that day, September 29, set out just before 8 p.m. from Kolombangara. Suddenly, up came a force the skippers identified as 3 American destroyers and a cruiser. The Japanese craft scattered like leaves in the wind, each skipper getting every last surge of power out of his engines as he moved to get away. Then up came several American PT boats to add to the confusion. Meanwhile, with all the activity there, the last mission, consisting of 4 other Daihatsus, moved into Tsukino Point and took off 329 men without incident. The United States PT boats were always a problem for the Japanese Daihatsus, if they were about. On September 30, off Kolombangara's North Point, several PT boats completely disrupted the attempt to move the troops out to Choiseul. The American craft discovered the Japanese at 7:45 p.m. The No. 1 Daihatsu was hard hit, but made it to the west side of Sunbi Island, where she got her 65 men off before sinking like a stone. The No. 2 Daihatsu managed to land 73 men at Sunbi after she was damaged. The No. 3 boat, which was carrying 90 men, was sunk offshore, but her men were rescued. The No. 4 boat arrived safely, having managed to sneak away from the PT boats. In all this action, the Japanese claimed that only 6 men were lost. That last mission on September 30 brought an end to the first phase of the Kolombangara evacuation. At that point, the Rabaul High Command decided on a change in direction because the evacuation of the 10,000 men on Kolombangara was taking far too long. At Rabaul, it seemed far too dangerous to continue going on the way they had for the past few weeks. The American air and naval pressure grew stronger every day. At Rabaul, the staff officers predicted that they would soon run into disaster, which meant loss of ships, and ships were like diamonds these days. To the men involved in carrying out the withdrawal, the new policy came as a dreadful shock. Higher authority decreed that the withdrawal should be suspended because the program was straining the fleet's destroyer resources. What somebody up top was talking about, obviously, was abandoning all the men south of Bougainville to the mercies of the enemy. The commander of the 8th Fleet gave the order, and many officers saw in the delay the death warrant for 8,000 men still on Kolombangara. For 2 days the debate continued at Rabaul, until finally the matter was decided. General Imamura and Admiral Kusaka were convinced that it would be worse than useless to leave those men to die. So the command issued reaffirming orders. Every man on Kolombangara will be rescued, and so on October 1, 1943, the rescue missions began again. At Rabaul, the destroyer command made preparations for the first trip, which would bring the destroyers to the north end of Kolombangara. They would continue for the next week on an emergency basis. Having set the policy, Rabaul Command was going flat out to do the job. It all worked almost like clockwork under the noses of the Americans, just as the Guadalcanal evacuation had been carried out. By the end of the week, the Kolombangara withdrawal was complete. Virtually all of the 10,000 men had been taken off safely and moved either to Bougainville or to Rabaul. The command boasted to Tokyo that not 1 man in 100 had been left behind. Given the Japanese decision to make the ultimate effort, what would have happened if Admiral Wilkinson had persisted in maintaining the cruisers up north is a matter for conjecture around the winter fire. Quite possibly he would have lost a cruiser or 2 without seriously impeding the Japanese action, because the Japanese technique of evacuation eliminated the need for the destroyers to stand in dangerous harbours and wait like sitting ducks. The Japanese destroyers were ready to fight to protect the troops in the small boats. Certainly it would have been useful to the Allies to have stopped the retreat of those 10,000 men, but they were not in a position to do so, particularly since the Japanese were prepared to throw everything they had at Truk into the scale to accomplish this evacuation. The Americans continued routine patrols, and in these the United States destroyers did sink some barges. They also caught the submarine I-20 on the surface and sank her. Once or twice they chased Japanese destroyer groups, and in one running fight they put a few holes in the topside of the destroyer Samidar, but they did not really accomplish much. Historian Samuel Eliot Morison faults the United States Navy for not understanding the Japanese evacuation techniques and for misuse of planes, ships, and PT boats. It all went back to the basic unfamiliarity of the Americans with night fighting techniques. Planes and PT boats and ships got their signals mixed up, and the cruiser and destroyer officers were perhaps afraid of being torpedoed or bombed as much by their friends as by their enemies. The Americans were still not very comfortable in fighting night naval actions, although by far the majority of the fighting in the South Pacific had been, and would be, at night. In view of later developments in the southern islands, it comes as something of a surprise to learn the extent of the effort the Japanese devoted to rescuing 600 or 700 men from Vella Lavella in the face of an approaching enemy. The Americans were literally swarming around Vella Lavella. Yet the Japanese were to employ 9 destroyers to defend the barge and sub-chaser flotilla that would actually take the troops from Vella Lavella to Bougainville, a distance of about 50 miles. The whole fleet numbered 9 destroyers, 4 sub-chasers, and 20 barges. Admiral Ijuin was again in command. There is an interesting comparison between the manner of operation of Admiral Ijuin and one of his predecessors. Admiral Raiso Tanaka, who was, on the record, the best destroyer commander the Japanese ever had. Tanaka had been given the first of the special missions during the Guadalcanal days. At that time, the Japanese Navy expected him to fight and deliver troops and supplies, and while placing a high priority on delivery, higher authority did not relieve the commander of the responsibility for winning a naval action at the same time. After several dangerous missions, Tanaka had the temerity to argue with Admiral Yamamoto that the use of destroyers to land supplies and reinforce troops was a misuse of weapons. Thereby Admiral Tanaka wrecked his career. Yamamoto hustled him out of the South Pacific, and he ended up running a sleepy navy yard in Rangoon. Admiral Ijuin was working under no such handicaps. He had already shown that he felt his primary responsibility was to his ships, and if necessary he would abandon a mission or delay it to keep out of a battle that might diminish the South Pacific's already strained destroyer fleet. And what Ijuin was doing was completely acceptable to his superiors, so much had the Pacific War already changed. The high officers of the Japanese General Staff still refused to think of themselves as on the defensive, except temporarily, but the facts spoke for themselves to the officers in the field. Before dawn on the morning of October 6, Admiral Ijuin set sail from Rabaul with 6 fighting destroyers, escorting 3 transport destroyers. Along the way they would pick up a number of sub-chasers, torpedo boats and barges. They would then evacuate the troops from the tip of Vella Lavella to Bougainville. Admiral Ijuin was commanding the force from the destroyer Akigumo, and he was operating with a simple plan that he had used before successfully. His first group of 4 fast new destroyers, Akigumo, Kazegumo, Yugumo, and Isokaze, were all rated at 35 knots. They would search for the enemy and engage him if he came out to attack the transport train. Meanwhile, Captain Tamichi Hara, with the slower Shigure and Samidare, would be prepared to strike the enemy from another angle, and while the fighting destroyers kept the enemy at bay, the transports would slip off and do their work. This plan had worked to perfection several times in the past few months, and so was highly regarded at Rabaul. The problem, of course, was that the Americans had enough experience with this sort of operation to know what to expect. That was Captain Hara's argument, but it went unheeded. October 6 was the sort of day the Japanese liked, dark and squally, which gave the Japanese a greater feeling of security against air attack as they moved down along the east coast of Bougainville. But their sense of security was misplaced. Their operational plan had been broadcast to the commander of the combined fleet, and the American radio interceptors had picked it up. At Pearl Harbor, the message was decoded long before the ships set out, and Admiral Halsey soon had the word. He advised Admiral Wilkinson that the Japanese would be coming down the slot to Marquana Bay to reach Vella Lavella, and he told when they would come and in what number. Sure enough, on the afternoon of October 6, an American search plane spotted the Japanese ships as they moved south, and a report was sent to Admiral Wilkinson. Admiral Wilkinson had a serious problem. The American destroyer force was heavily occupied just then in escorting convoys to Guadalcanal and Munda. The only 3 destroyers actually uncommitted were the Selfridge, Chevalier and O'Bannon, under command of Captain Frank Walker, which had been assigned to the patrol of the slot against Japanese troop movement. But since there were so many more Japanese ships involved, Wilkinson also detailed Captain Harold Larson with the Balfe Talbot, Lavalette and Taylor to leave his convoy and hurry to Marquana Bay to intercept the enemy. In mid-afternoon, when the Japanese knew they had been spotted by the American plane, they altered their formation, increasing the distance between ships and between the 3 groups of ships. They expected air attack within a matter of hours, but the weather was so foul that no air attack arrived, although off Choiseul they did become aware of a number of planes that could not find them in the squalls. At sunset, Admiral Ijuin detached his fast destroyers from the rest of the group and sped along with them toward Vella Lavella. He intended to intercept any Americans who were about, and the other ships, as ordered, slowed to 9 knots and stood toward the Shortlands. The barges and patrol craft were to come out soon after dark, and these other destroyers would escort them to the rendezvous and stand guard, while they and the troop carriers picked up the sailors and soldiers on Vella Lavella. After dark also, the ubiquitous Japanese float planes were out, and they came close enough to Captain Walker's force that he figured he had been spooked and thus deprived of the element of surprise. That was not quite true, but the Japanese did make visual contact with the Americans before the American radar caught the Japanese. The reason was probably the moving of the squalls that tended to distort the radar reception with static. Admiral Lewin then considered how to deal with the American destroyers. He believed there were 4 of them. As he was making a plan, his radio officer announced receipt of a message that 4 enemy cruisers and 3 more destroyers were moving west around Vella Lavella. This report gave Admiral Lewin a great deal of concern, and his destroyer force was not capable of dealing with 4 cruisers very satisfactorily. So the Admiral issued an order to his captains to be prepared to reverse course, abandon the mission on a moment's notice. Actually, that second report referred to Captain Larson's group of 3 destroyers and represented bad reporting by an inexperienced pilot. Captain Walker's 3 destroyers moved steadily toward Marquana Bay, and at 10:30 that night they made contact with the Japanese. The 2 sides then began manoeuvring, while the transports moved in to Marquana Bay to pick up the troops. Admiral Lewin led the enemy away from Marquana Bay, and when they were about 6 miles apart, Admiral Lewin suddenly ordered his ships to turn left and prepare to attack with torpedoes. At the same time, Captain Walker prepared to open fire with his guns, and did. The shells began heading toward the lead Japanese ship, the Yagumo. Some began to strike, 1 or 2 disabled her rudder. Then the Americans fired torpedoes, and one of these headed toward the Yagumo. Her captain could not maneuver to escape, and the torpedo struck her squarely in the side. The ship began to burn brightly and slow down, and the Americans shifted their fire to the Shigure and the Samidare, but they made the mistake of thinking the Yagumo, which was obviously dying, was out of the fight. The Yagumo fired torpedoes, and one of these hit the American destroyer Chevalier. The torpedo struck her in the port bow, just opposite the forward magazine, and the combined power of torpedo and ammunition blew apart the entire forward part of the ship as far back as the bridge. The engines kept turning, and the forward motion threatened to drive the Chevalier under until the captain got a message to the engine room to back engines. At the same time, he told a signalman to use his blinker to warn the O'Bannon, which was just behind. But the signalman, who had been knocked about by the blast, fainted before he could send the message. The O'Bannon came charging up as the Chevalier backed, and the O'Bannon rammed into the starboard side of the ship, her bow penetrating the Chevalier aft engine room. Probably the failure of the signalman made no difference, and in the heat of the battle, and given the sudden slowing of the Chevalier, the collision would seem to have been inevitable. The Selfridge continued to try to close on the Japanese, but the range was too great for the American torpedoes to reach the Japanese ships beyond the Yagumo. It was not, however, too great for the Japanese torpedoes. Earlier, during the wild manoeuvring, the Japanese destroyers Shigure and Samidare had launched 16 torpedoes. The Selfridge ran smack into one of these, and the explosion caused her to slow down and take water. There were many casualties, but fortunately no vital parts were destroyed, nor were the magazines hit. By this time, the 3 original American destroyers were out of the fight, but the 3 commanded by Captain Larson were just nearing the scene, so they could get into it. As they came up, they were spotted by one of the Japanese float planes, which warned Admiral Ijuin, believing that at least 3 American cruisers were now descending on him. Admiral Ijuin turned and headed back for Rabaul, and the battle for Vella Lavella came to an end. The result was a victory for the Japanese in every sense. The troop transport destroyers had broken off at the first sign of action and headed for Vella Lavella's North Shore base. Within the hour of arrival, they were loading the 600 or 700 troops, and an hour later were underway. Vella Lavella was evacuated without the loss of a man, and the loss of life aboard the sunken Japanese destroyer Yugumo was believed to be complete, but in fact about a third of the crewmen were rescued by American PT boats. That is remarkable. First, that the Japanese would submit to rescue, and second, that the Americans would continue the task after one Japanese crewman rewarded an American sailor for a cup of coffee by killing him. When the battle ended, the Yugumo was sunk, and the American Chevalier had to be sunk by a torpedo from the Lavalette. The Selfridge's crew managed to make temporary repairs and get their crippled ship back to Tulagi. The O'Bannon made her way back, crippled bow and all, and a few days later was sent home to the United States for a breather and major repair. Japanese and American intelligence were some time in truly assessing the battle. It was a typical encounter in this campaign of attrition. The Americans came back claiming 3 destroyers sunk with damage to 3 or 4 more. Admiral Ijuin went back to Rabaul, believing he had faced a reinforced cruiser force and had sunk 2 of them, as well as 3 destroyers. The Japanese had won the engagement, but they had lost another destroyer. The High Command was not pleased when Admiral Ijuin reported in. In Japanese fashion, he was not chided, but with considerable fanfare, Admiral Kusaka held a party at the Officers' Club. He and Admiral Samajima, commander of the 8th Fleet, made much of the presentation of a ceremonial sword and daggers to 3 of Ijuin's subordinates, without a word for Ijuin's performance. So much had the war changed that Admiral Ijuin, who had fought his battle and won, was nearly as badly disgraced as had been Admiral Tanaka, who had also won. Tanaka had knocked out a far superior force, but had failed to complete his mission of supplying the Japanese troops on Guadalcanal. Admiral Ijuin had won his battle and carried out the task of withdrawing the troops brilliantly, and still he was in trouble. The official displeasure could be attributed to a growing realization that the war was going badly, and for the Japanese, indeed it was. With the Battle of Vella Lavella, the campaign for the Central Solomons was over. In spite of the attrition, the Allies had won and were now prepared to move ahead against the Northern Solomons. A few more victories, such as Admiral Ijuin's, said the wags at Rabaul, and the Japanese Navy would lose the war. Admiral Halsey had the Central Solomons, although there were times during the struggle for New Georgia when the campaign had threatened to become a fiasco. The worst problem for the Allies had been the misreading of the difficulties. The amphibious command had asked for about 3 times as many troops as it got. The request was rejected because the troops were not available. That lack has to be weighed against the apparent incompetence of the ground command and inexperienced troops. Furthermore, the Americans still had a good deal to learn about fighting the Japanese at sea. In spite of the enormous advantage of radar, the Allied Navy was still not winning all the sea victories by far. The Japanese army had withdrawn its air forces from the region during the New Georgia campaign. The army claimed the planes were needed to protect army installations and support army moves in New Guinea. The real reason was the same sort of antagonism that had caused the Navy pilots to blame the Army for the death of Admiral Yamamoto. The cooperation ordered by Tokyo between services was never more than skin-deep, except under the most rigorous circumstances. Despite the loss of the Army planes, the Naval Air Force was still potent. In fact, the Japanese Army Air Force never did amount to much in the Solomons campaigns. Its pilots were simply not well enough trained in that sort of combat. Perhaps encounters with the Japanese Army pilots accounted for the easy victories claimed by many American flyers. In any event, Americans tended to over-exaggerate their victories and underplay those of the enemy. This was a weakness shared by the Japanese, at great cost to themselves. The most serious American error, perhaps, was to overestimate the numbers of Japanese casualties and underestimate the Japanese ability to withdraw troops. Admiral Halsey, who was fond of hyperbole, asserted that all Americans could fight better than all Japanese. How much better they were supposed to be depended on the mood of the moment. The degree of superiority ranged as high as 20 times better. In the fall of 1943, there was still reason for this exaggeration, however. Halsey had ended the Guadalcanal campaign with the assertion that the Japanese were not supermen, an opinion Tokyo's propagandists had fostered successfully throughout the world in the first halcyon days of their war. The subtle fear that such might be the case had penetrated deep into the American psyche, as Halsey knew so well. His constant stream of verbal abuse against the Japanese, verbal slur, was really carefully measured propaganda for troop and American home consumption. For Halsey understood the American press and its relationship to the public better than any other commander except MacArthur. In spite of the difficulties, Halsey had pulled off the victory, and in October 1943 was ready to take the next step toward Rabaul, the capture of Bougainville. As the Japanese in the South Pacific knew very well, the battle for Bougainville was going to be far more difficult than the one for New Georgia, and even more difficult than the battle for Guadalcanal. This is because Bougainville is the premier island of the Solomons, 130 miles long and 30 miles wide, with about the land area of the big island of Hawaii. It was not the land area, but the large number of bays and landing places that would give trouble. Weeks before the evacuation of Kolombangara, the Japanese had known what to expect. Soldiers moving around on Bougainville had found carelessly discarded American K-ration boxes at several points near the coastline. Japanese intelligence deduced that the Americans were searching for the most favorable point to stage a landing. Fortunately for the Americans, the boxes were found at widely disparate points, so they did not tip off the location of the coming landings. For Japanese morale, it was just as well that the Japanese soldiers and sailors in the South Pacific were not aware of the futile nature of their defense activities. In the spring, before the New Georgia landings, the Imperial General Staff had, as noted, written off the whole area south of Truk and Rabaul. That was the reason for Admiral Kusaka's hesitation in completing the evacuation of Kolombangara. But on September 30, Imperial Headquarters had instructed Admiral Kusaka and General Imamura to hold as long as possible all along the southeastern front. Despite talk of victory, the Imperial General Staff was under no illusions. The orders did not call for any last-man stands, and the orders were in no way peremptory. They used such terms as make every effort, and were, in fact, most reasonable. These new instructions from Tokyo indicated that Rabaul must be the centre of this defence line. The Japanese in the field were asked to make that effort to repulse all enemy attacks by protracted defence at Bougainville and in northern New Guinea. These are not the words of winners. The Imperial High Command had in no sense changed its strategic aim of the spring. The generals and admirals had simply persuaded themselves that the Northern Solomons and New Guinea were to be held as long as possible, without real possibility of success, to give Tokyo time. The time was for the build-up and execution of offensives on two other fronts: China, where the Imperial Army was to drive into Chungking, and India, where the army was to attack along the western border of Burma and drive through Imphal toward Afghanistan. After the Imperial General Headquarters had laid out the General Defense Program for senior commanders, they passed it along. General Imamura, commander of the 8th Area Army, prepared a special message for all the units under his general command. This went out in a package with his own interpretation of the Imperial Staff's policy declaration. On the right-hand side of the page, reading up and down, as Japanese does, was printed the Imperial General Staff's text. On the left-hand side of the page was a detailed explanation of the policy and general orders, as well as Imamura's instructions to every unit, from the 17th Army Command down to the divisional and even regimental level, concerning their specific responsibilities under the new orders.